This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lord Kitchener by G.K. Chesterton. Section 4. Personally, as has already been noted, Lord Kitchener never was and never pretended to be anything more or less than the good military man, and by the time of the Great War he was already an elderly military man. The type has much the same standards and traditions in all European countries, but in England it is, if anything, a little more traditional, for the very reason that the army has been something separate, professional and relatively small, a sort of club. The military man was all the more military because the nation was not military. Such a man is inevitably conservative in his views, conventional in his manners, and simplifies the problem of patriotism to a single-eyed obedience. When he took over the business of raising the first levies for the present war, he was confronted with the problem of the English trades unions, the very last problem in the world which one could reasonably expect such a man to understand. And yet he did understand it. He was perhaps the only person in the governing class who did. If it be hard to explain to the richer classes in England, it is almost impossible to explain to any classes in any other country, because the English situation is largely unique. There is the same difficulty as we have already found in describing how vast and even violent a transformation scene the growth of the great army appeared. It has been almost impossible to describe it to the chief conscript countries, which take a great army for granted. The key to the parallel problem of the trades unions is simply this, that England is the only European country that is practically industrial and nothing else. Trades unions can never play such a part in countries where the masses live on the land. Such masses always have some status and support, yes, even if they are serfs. The status of the English working man is not in the earth. It is, so to speak, in the air, in a scaffolding of artificial abstractions, a framework of rules and rights, of verbal bargains or paper resolutions. If he loses this, he becomes nothing so human or homely as a slave. Rather, he becomes a wild beast, a sort of wandering vermin with no place in the state at all. It would be necessary to explain this and a great deal more, which cannot possibly be explained here, before we could measure the enormity of the enigma facing the British official who had to propose to the English the practical suspension of the trades unions. To this must be added the fact that the unions, already national institutions, had just lately been in a ferment with new and violent doctrines. Syndicalists had invoked them as the future seats of government. Historical speculators had seen in them the return to the great Christian guilds of the Middle Ages. A more revolutionary press had appeared to champion them. Gigantic strikes had split the country in every direction. Anyone would have said that under these circumstances the very virtues and attainments of Kitchener would at least make it fairly certain that he would quarrel with the trades unions. It soon became apparent that the one man who was not going to quarrel with the trades unions was Kitchener. Politicians and parliamentary leaders, supposed actually to be elected by the working classes, were regarded rightly or wrongly with implacable suspicion. The elderly and old-fashioned Anglo-Egyptian militarist, with his doctrine and discipline of the barrack-room and the drumhead court-martial, was never regarded by the workers with a shade of suspicion. They simply took him at his word, and the leader of the most turbulent trades unions element paid to him after his death the simplest tribute in the plainest and most popular language. He was a straight man. I am so antiquated as to think it a better epithet than the fashionable phrase about a strong man. Some silent, indescribable geniality of fairness in the man once more prevailed against the possibility of passionate misunderstandings, as it had prevailed against the international nervousness of the atmosphere of Fashoda or the tragic border feud of the Boers. I suspect that it lay largely in the fact that this great Englishman was sufficiently English to guess one thing missed by many more sophisticated people, that the English trades unions are very English. For good or evil, they are national. They have very little in common with the more international socialism of the Continent, and nothing whatever in common with the pedantic socialism of Prussia. Understanding his countrymen by instinct, he did not make a parade of efficiency, for the English dislike the symbols of dictatorship much more than dictatorship. They hate the crown and the sceptre of the tyrant much more than his tyranny. They have a national tradition which allows of far too much inequality, so long as it is softened with a certain camaraderie, and in which even snobs only remember the coronet of a nobleman on condition that he shall himself seem to forget it. The other matter is much more important. Though the reverse of vivacious, Kitchener was very vital, and he had one unique mark of vitality, that he had not stopped growing. An oak should not transplant at 60, said the great orator Grattan, when he was transferred from the Parliament of Dublin to the Parliament of Westminster. Kitchener was 64 when he turned his face westward to the problems of his own country. There clung to him already all the traditional attributes of the oak, its toughness, its angularity, its closeness of grain and ruggedness of outline. When he was uprooted from the Arabian sands and replanted in the remote western island. Yet the oak not only grew green again and put forth new leaves, it was almost as if in a legend it could put forth a new kind of leaves. Kitchener, with all his taciturnity, really began to put forth a new order of ideas. If a change of opinions is unusual in an elderly man, it is almost unknown in an elderly military man. If the hardening of time was felt even by the poetic and emotional Grattan, it would not have been strange if the hardening had been quite hopeless in the rigid and reticent Kitchener. Yet it was not hopeless, and the fact became the spring of much of the national hope. The grizzled martinet from India and Egypt showed a certain power which is in nearly all great men, but of which St. Paul has become the traditional type, the power of being a great convert as well as a great crusader. It is the real power of reforming an opinion, which is the very opposite of that mere formlessness which we call fickleness. Nor is the comparison to such an example as St. Paul altogether historically disproportionate, for the point upon which this very typical Englishman changed his mind was a point which is now the pivot of the whole future, and perhaps of the very existence of Christendom. For many such Englishmen it might almost be called the discovery of Christendom. It can be called with greater precision, and indeed with almost complete precision, the discovery of Russia. Military bureaucratic systems everywhere have too much tendency to work upon one idea, and there was a time when the military and bureaucratic system of the British in the East worked on the idea of the fear of Russia. It is needless here to explain that sentiment, and useless to explain it away. It was partly a mere tradition from the natural jingoism of the Crimean War. It was partly in itself a tribute to the epic majesty of the Russian march across mysterious Asia to the legendary Chinese Wall. The point here is that it existed, and where there exists such an idea and such military rulers, they very seldom alter their idea. But Kitchener did alter his idea, not in mere military obedience, but in genuine human reasonableness. He came late in life to see the Russian as the friend and the Prussian as the enemy. In the inevitable division of British ministerial councils about the distribution of British aid and attention, he was the one man who stood most enthusiastically, one might say stubbornly, for the supreme importance of munitioning the magnificent Russian defence. He mystified all the English pessimists in what seemed to them the blackest hour of pessimism by announcing that Germany had shot her bolt, that she had already lost her chance, not by any of the Allied attacks, but by the stupendous skill and valour of that Russian retreat, which was more triumphant than any attack. It is this discovery that marks an epoch, for that great deliverance was not only the victory of Russia, but very specially the victory of the Russians. Never before was there such a war of men against guns, as awful and inspiring to watch as a war of men against demons. Perhaps the duel of a man with a modern gun is more like that between a man and an enormous dragon. Nor is there anything on the weaker side save the ultimate and almost metaphysical truth that a man can make a gun and a gun cannot make a man. It is the man, the Russian soldier and the peasant himself, who has emerged like the hero of an epic, and who is now secure forever from the sophisticated scandal-mongering and the cultured ignorance of the West. And it is this that lends an epic and almost primeval symbolism to the tragedy of Kitchener's End. Somehow the very fact that it was incomplete as an action makes it more complete as an allegory. English in his very limitations, English in his late emancipation from them, he was setting forth on an eastward journey, different indeed from the many eastward journeys of his life. There are many such noble tragedies of travel in the records of his country. It was so, silently, without a trace, that the track of Franklin faded in the polar snows, or the track of Gordon in the desert sands. But this was an adventure new for such adventurous men, the finding not of strange foes, but of friends yet stranger. Many men of his blood and type, simple, strenuous, somewhat prosaic, had threaded their way through some dark continent to add some treasure or territory to the English name. He was seeking what for us, his countrymen, has long been a dark continent, but which contains a much more noble treasure, the glory of a great people, long hidden from the English by accidents and by lies, lay before him at his journey's end. That journey was never ended. It remained like a mighty bridge, the mightier for being broken, pointing across a chasm and promising a mightier thoroughfare between the East and the West. In that waste of seas beyond the last northern islets where his ship went down, one might fancy his spirit standing, a figure frustrated yet prophetic, and pointing to the East, whence are the light of the world and the reunion of Christian men. The End of Lord Kitchener by G. K. Chesterton.